welcome to the deep dive. You sent over some really interesting source material, and we've gone through it all.
Yeah, dug into it.
Exactly. Pulled out the key stuff and basically put together this deep dive just for you.
And today, we're tackling a big one, the future of retirement, specifically looking at Brazil's INSS system, their social security.
Right, and it's all based directly on that source material you sent.
And it doesn't pull any punches, does it? Jumps straight in.
No, it really doesn't.
Yeah.
It kicks off with a, frankly, pretty alarming idea. Suggests Social Security, like the INSS, might not be sustainable.
It even uses that phrase pyramid scheme.
Which, definitely taps into a fear that's out there.
And then it pivots, adds some nuance right away. It acknowledges the fear, sure, but then it kind of challenges you to think bigger.
How so?
Well, it points out that society itself relies on a similar structure, fundamentally. It depends on births, on new people coming in.
Ah, right. And it has that thought experiment. What was it?
Yeah, like what if everyone just stopped having kids? Tomorrow, 0 births.
How long would society even last?
Yeah.
It really forces you to see that basic demographic dependence.
Exactly. It shifts the focus from just, spreadsheet numbers to biology, demographics, the real basics.
Okay, so our mission here is to unpack these arguments from the source, understand the predictions it's making for retirement in Brazil.
And crucially, look at what the source suggests you might be able to do about it.
Even though, as the source admits, it's not exactly an optimistic picture?
No, not much room for rose-tinted glasses, as you said. Let's see what it actually predicts.
Okay, but before we get to the really blunt stuff, quick word about our sponsor, who is actually mentioned right there in the source material. Manual.
Ah, yes, Manual.
The source makes this kind of playful link. If all this talk about retirement stress is keeping you up at night.
And maybe causing a bit more hair loss than you'd like.
Exactly. Then Manual is presented as something that could potentially help.
The source mentions how dealing with baldness can sneak up on you. You notice the hairline changing, a bit more hair in the drain.
Yeah, and then you start trying to, hide it. The source writer even mentioned their own experience with it. It's a real thing.
But the good news, according to the material, is whether it's early signs or more advanced, Manual offers these personalized treatments.
Science-backed, right. And it comes in a discrete box delivered to your home.
Yeah, the process sounds pretty simple based on the source. You fill out an online questionnaire.
Helps figure out the right treatment for you specifically.
Right. Then you order, it shows up, and it includes ongoing support from a medical specialist.
At no extra cost, it said, which is good.
Definitely. And results. The source says you could see visible changes from about 3 months, with things getting more noticeable around 4 months.
If you're disciplined about it, they emphasize.
Consistency is key, yeah. And there's a special offer mentioned for you, the listener. A link in the original material gets you 40% off your first purchase.
And free shipping in Brazil. The source kind of frames it as, your self-esteem is important, worth every hair.
And a nice little pun there, too. Manual from the Manual de Economia.
Yeah. All right, so check them out.
Okay, practical stuff aside for a moment.
Okay, yeah. Deep breath. Let's get into that core prediction from the source, the big one.
Right. So according to this analysis, if you're currently, say, under 20, maybe 25 years old,
yeah,
the prediction is pretty stark. You will likely not retire through the INSS before you hit age 70.
Wow, 70. And that's if the system even exists like it does now by that.
That's the kicker. Yeah, that's the caveat.
So what's the main reason? Why so definite?
Demographics, basically. The source points to the year 2060 as a key moment.
Okay.
By then, Brazil's population pyramid is expected to have flipped, completely reversed. It'll look, demographically speaking, like Japan does today.
Japan. Okay. Everyone knows Japan has an aging population. But is Brazil's situation exactly the same, or are there differences?
There are crucial differences, according to the source, and they're not good ones for Brazil.
Uh-oh. Like what?
Well, first, Brazil already spends more per person on Social Security than Japan does right now.
Even though Japan has way more elderly people relative to its population.
Exactly. Brazil has 3 times fewer elderly people proportionally, but already spends more per capita on supporting them via Social Security. Think about that burden.
So, higher costs per retiree, even before the big wave hits. What's the second disadvantage?
The second point the source makes is that Brazil is roughly 3 times poorer than Japan.
Oh, so we're starting from a much lower economic base.
Right, already spending relatively more, before the major demographic crunch really bites.
You can see why the source titled that chapter something like, Why You Might Not Retire, as you imagined.
Yeah, these factors really hammer that point home.
Okay, so given that rather grim forecast, does the source offer any way out? Any scenarios where this doesn't happen, even if they're long shots?
It does look at what would have to happen. It lists 4 possibilities, but calls them extremely improbable.
Okay, extremely improbable. What's the first one?
First, the demographic projections themselves are just completely wrong. And fertility rates in Brazil suddenly shoot back up to, say, 2 or 2.5 children per woman.
And stay there for decades.
Right. The source thinks this is highly unlikely. Why? Because these kinds of demographic projections historically tend to be very, very accurate.
So betting the demographers are way off probably isn't wise. What's number 2?
Number 2 is a massive, almost unimaginable leap in productivity, something that lets a much smaller workforce generate vastly more wealth.
Like technology saving the day.
On a huge scale, the source talks about things like the Industrial Revolution or maybe even bigger.
Wow. Specific examples.
It mentions things like, widespread fusion energy or super cheap, ubiquitous robotics and automation, things that fundamentally change the economic equation.
And how likely does the source think that is?
It actually calls this the least improbable of the first 3, but still stresses it would need something extremely disproportional, way beyond normal progress.
Okay. Still a very, very long shot then. What's the third improbable escape route?
Third is Brazil suddenly attracting massive waves of young immigrants, enough to really change the age structure of the population.
And then the source thinks.
Calls it Fantasyland.
Ouch. Why so dismissive?
Well, the argument is that countries generally need to be developed, prosperous, and attractive first to draw large numbers of immigrants.
Right. People usually emigrate for better opportunities.
Exactly. So Brazil kind of needs the young population to help it develop, but it needs to be developed to attract that population in the first place.
It's a catch-22.
Pretty much. The source suggests the scale of immigration needed just isn't realistic under current or likely future conditions.
And you said there were 4 points. What was the last one?
Oh, the fourth one the source throws in is just Luciano Hangaucho. Seems like a little inside joke or something to check if you're still reading closely.
Okay, got it. So seriously then, the source is basically saying a big baby boom or mass immigration solving this are highly unlikely to fantasy.
That seems to be the assessment, yeah. Which leaves the demographic trend itself as the core issue.
Which leads us to this idea the source explains.
Yeah.
The demographic transition. Can you break that down simply based on the material?
Sure. It's basically the historical path most countries take. You start with high birth rates, lots of kids.
Okay.
That eventually creates a large generation of working-age people. This is the demographic bonus period. It can fuel economic growth, increase productivity, make the country richer.
Makes sense. More workers, potentially more wealth. Then what?
Then comes the transition part. As the country gets richer, quality of life improves, but the cost of raising kids goes up, family structures change.
People start having fewer children?
Exactly. Fertility rates fall. And eventually, the population starts to age. You end up with proportionally more older people than younger people.
And the source gives examples of countries that have gone through this whole cycle.
Yeah, it mentions Germany, Italy, Japan, South Korea, countries we now think of as having aging populations.
So where does Brazil fit into this? Did we just skip the getting rich part?
That's essentially the source's argument. It says Brazil did go through the transition. Fertility rates fell, quite rapidly in fact. Brazil now has fewer children per couple than places like the US, Norway, Sweden, even France.
Wow, okay.
But the critical problem, highlighted in the source, is that Brazil didn't manage to fully capitalize on its demographic bonus period. It didn't achieve high levels of productivity and development before the population started aging significantly.
So we got old before we got rich, unlike those other countries.
That's the stark way the source puts it, and the consequence. It's now much, much harder to grow the economy from this point.
Is Japan the example again here?
Yes, the source uses Japan. Rapid growth during its boom years, then stagnation, very little growth once the population aged.
And the source applies that logic to Brazil.
Yeah, the reality check it delivers is pretty blunt. Brazil basically missed the development train.
Oof, that's tough. So, okay, let's connect the dots. Social Security likely changing drastically because of these demographics.
Compounded by the fact Brazil aged before reaching high development levels.
Right. So what does this actually feel like? What does the source say this means for life in Brazil in the coming decades?
Well, one point it stresses is that Brazil is aging incredibly fast. 3 times faster it says, than many developed countries did.
Meaning even less time to adjust.
Exactly. And remember, even those developed countries that had more time are finding it really difficult.
What kinds of difficulties? What examples does the source give from other aging nations?
It mentions Italy, a growing crisis of loneliness and isolation among the elderly, really sad stories of people dying alone, not found for years sometimes.
Wow.
Also, labor shortages. Companies struggle to hire because high taxes needed partly for pensions make it hard to offer competitive wages.
And Japan, similar issues.
Similar problems with isolation, yes. The source also talks about the hollowing out of rural areas. Young people leave for cities, don't have kids back home.
Villages get abandoned.
Right. It mentions a statistic that something like 40% of Japan's municipalities are at risk of disappearing eventually.
And the source is saying this isn't just some far-off future for Brazil. It's happening now.
It claims the scenario is already unfolding in parts of Brazil, specifically calls out Rio Grande do Sul as an example where you can see these trends emerging.
Is there any upside mentioned? Any potential positive spin?
Barely. The source offers what it calls semi-positive news about property prices.
Okay.
The logic is fewer people overall might mean less demand for housing, potentially pushing prices down.
Basic supply and demand.
Big caveats immediately follow. This is mostly likely only in smaller inland towns that are actively losing population.
Not in the big cities.
Probably not. The trend is young people moving to the big cities. So unless there's a massive surge in construction, rents and apartment prices there are likely to keep going up.
Okay, so not exactly a silver lining for most people. What's the overall outlook then, according to this analysis?
It's one of increasing pressure. The costs of healthcare and pensions for a larger elderly population are going to rise sharply.
And fewer working-age people to pay for it all.
Exactly. So the source concludes the younger generation gets squeezed. Higher taxes, higher cost of living, all to fund these growing obligations.
And another pension reform is inevitable?
Seen as unavoidable, yes. But the source argues that without more births or immigrants, which it deems unlikely, any reform is just delaying the inevitable collapse or transformation of the current system.
It really paints a picture where structural fixes from the top seem difficult, to say the least. Does the source talk about what the government could or should do, even if it's skeptical?
It does touch on that, but it frames it as needing the government to make almost exclusively the right decisions.
Which implies?
Yeah, implies it's a pretty high bar, maybe unlikely. It lists three main things.
Okay, what are they?
First, really accepting that the public budget is limited, spending has to be efficient, stop wasting money on unnecessary privileges and lobbying.
Financial discipline. Makes sense. What's number two?
Second, tackling the massive distortions and inequalities in the current pension system itself.
Examples.
The source gives the example of public sector pensions often being around 8 times higher than private sector ones, sometimes with shorter contribution times. It also specifically calls military pensions absurd.
So making the system fairer and more efficient internally.
That's the idea. And the third point, maybe the most important.
Let me guess. Productivity.
You got it. Massively increasing the economy's productivity, learning to do more with less, because the shrinking workforce is the new reality.
No. Any specific suggestions there?
It mentions things like improving how the justice system works, making it more efficient, and opening up markets more to spur competition and innovation. The hope is that productivity gains could somehow make up for having fewer workers.
Okay, so those are the big, difficult things the government would need to do. But then the source shifts focus pretty dramatically, right?
Yeah.
To the individual.
It does. It almost feels like it lays out the government challenges and then says, okay, but realistically?
Yeah.
It references this idea that Brazil often only acts decisively when our backs are against the wall, which leads straight into practical advice for you. Less about fixing the macro picture, more about personal strategy.
All right, let's get into that. What are the concrete tips the source gives for individuals navigating this future?
There are 5, right?
5 main ones, yeah. First piece of advice is very direct. Do not buy property in small towns where the population is shrinking and aging.
Even if prices seem low or might fall further.
Especially then. The source flat out challenges the idea that property always goes up. Says there's no economic law for that. If demand dries up because everyone leaves,
the price will fall.
Exactly. It points to those abandoned villages in Japan as proof. Property can become worthless if nobody wants it.
That's a really important counter-narrative. Okay, what's tip number 2?
Learn to save and invest, early and consistently.
The classic advice. Yeah, but with urgency. Save something every month, even if it's small. Cut out superfluous spending. Build capital. And crucially, invest it so it holds its value against inflation and whatever economic changes come.
Does it say how to invest?
It gives one specific warning. Don't put everything in, like the stock market. It says it's too volatile. One bad global event could wipe out your savings. So diversification, caution.
Makes sense. Build wealth carefully. Tip number 3.
Specialize. Learn. Get really, really good at something. The source says, study like crazy, learn new languages, to
Right.
increase your earning power, obviously, but also to make yourself valuable anywhere in the world. It's about mobility and options. If your skills are in demand globally, you have more flexibility.
Become indispensable, or at least highly valuable globally. A personal hedge. Okay, number 4.
This one's about literal mobility. If you can, get dual citizenship or at least keep a valid passport for another country if you're eligible.
As a safety net.
Exactly. The source calls it a Plan B. Basically, an option to jump ship if things get really difficult in Brazil down the line.
A practical escape hatch,
Yes.
though maybe not accessible to everyone. And the 5th and final tip.
This one's for potential entrepreneurs. If you're thinking of starting a business in Brazil,
Yeah.
recognize that the market for goods and services aimed at the elderly is almost guaranteed to grow significantly.
Finding opportunity within the demographic shift itself.
Precisely. Catering to the needs of the growing older population is presented as a relatively safe bet, business-wise.
So it's a tough overall picture from the source, but it doesn't leave you completely adrift. It offers these concrete individual actions you can take.
Right. They're presented as ways you can build personal resilience, acknowledging that you probably can't count on the big system or the government to solve it all for you.
Okay, so let's try to wrap this up. This deep dive, based on your source material, paints a picture of a really significant challenge for Brazil's retirement system.
Driven by demographics, fundamentally.
Right. With limited, very difficult options for government fixes.
Which puts a lot of emphasis back on individual planning and action, preparing for a future that might look quite different.
It's definitely a lot to think about. And the source thanks you, the listener, for sticking with it.
Yeah, it's heavy stuff, but important.
And as you process all this, the aging population, the squeeze on the young, the need for productivity, those individual strategies, maybe, here's a final thought to chew on, building on the source.
Okay.
If the traditional retirement model, the pension system, is under so much strain and the demographics aren't really going to reverse, how might the very idea of retirement itself need to change for you, for society?
You mean beyond just the money?
Yeah. Like,
Uh,
what new social structures or community models or ways we think about the later stages of life might need to emerge? If the old system can't fully cope, what replaces it, not just financially, but socially?
That's a big question. A potential redefinition of work, community, purpose in later life, maybe, especially in a world with proportionally fewer young people.
Something to definitely mull over.